Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and Clockstruck Wrong Hour, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Hour No One Heard. The scream echoed, once sharply, then vanished into the folds of the velvet-draped study like a breath stifled beneath the weight of time itself. A single candle guttered near the hearth, casting grotesque shadows on the tall grandfather clock, whose pendulum now swayed, out of rhythm. The clock read 10:07, but outside, the village bell tolled 11. Hercule Poirot paused at the threshold, his patent leather shoes clicking against the black-and-white marble tiles. He did not speak. His eyes, sharp as a scalpel, absorbed the room's every detail in a single sweep. The overturned brandy snifter, the spilled ashtray, the tuft of golden thread near the chaise longue. The body, crumpled in an unnatural heap by the fireplace, wore a frozen expression of disbelief. "A curious thing," murmured Chief Inspector Harrow, rubbing his mustache with fingers that betrayed a tremor. "Lady Carmichael claims she found him like this at precisely 10 o'clock, but the clock, it stopped 7 minutes later. No one heard the shot." Poirot crouched, careful not to disturb the delicate line of dust near the baseboard. "Ah, mon ami," he said softly, almost to himself, "the dead do not often lie, but the living, they compose symphonies of falsehoods." 3 people had been inside the manor when the shot was fired. Each had motive, each claimed ignorance, each lied, subtly, and in a different key. Lady Gwendolen Carmichael, draped in mourning black, though her husband's blood was barely dry, held herself with the hauteur that belonged on a stage. "I was in the solarium," she said, her voice hollow but measured. "With the maid. I heard nothing, I assure you. Nothing at all." Poirot tilted his head. "Madame, your hands, they are damp and faintly scented, of lemon verbena, I believe. A curious choice so late in the evening." She blinked. A flicker, a second too long before answering. "I needed calming. It was the only oil I could find." The maid, Elsie Hargrove, pale and freckled, was barely more than 20. "I never left the kitchen, sir," she said quickly, her eyes darting. I didn't know anything had happened till Lady Gwen screamed." "But Lady Gwen did not scream," Poirot said, turning slightly as if inspecting the drapes for meaning. "You just told me you were in the kitchen, mademoiselle, and yet you knew that it was she who found him." Elsie stammered. I assumed, you deduced, a dangerous habit when one is concealing something." And then there was the brother, Edmund Vale, a banker, cold, precise, the kind of man who sharpened pencils with quiet menace. "My brother-in-law and I disagreed about the will," he admitted, as if stating an account balance. "But I would hardly shoot him over a difference in percentage." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Yet, you are left with the Carmichael estate should Lady Gwen decline the inheritance." "She won't." "Ah," spoken like a man certain of a woman's grief, or her guilt. The storm outside raged harder, wind clawing at the mullioned windows. Somewhere the house creaked, old bones shifting under the weight of secrets. Poirot walked slowly to the mantel, examining the antique clock. He tapped the glass gently, then inspected the brass casing. A slight scratch, barely visible. "What do you make of that, Poirot?" Harrow asked. "Someone tampered with this clock, mon ami. It has been rewound, but not with care." He turned to the inspector, then to the trio standing stiffly in the room. "The question is not who fired the pistol. The question, mes amis, is why did none of you hear it?" A silence fell. Poirot's voice, always calm, now carried weight, like lead. "Because the shot was never fired. Not when you say, not at 10 o'clock. No, this murder occurred precisely at 9:15. Lady Gwen gasped. "Impossible. Non-probable. The fire was lit after death. The position of the blood pool, too far from the hearth. The ash on the left sleeve, unburnt. The wound shows signs of early coagulation. The candle near the body has burned precisely 1 inch since it was replaced. 1 hour, give or take." Poirot turned, his voice a whisper now, though every word struck like thunder. "The clock struck 10 because someone desired it to, but the true hour of death. No one heard because the gramophone was playing." He pointed at the far corner, where the old Victrola sat, dust disturbed. A record sleeve open, a sonata in D minor, 12 minutes long, loud enough to cover a gunshot. Poirot walked slowly across the room to a small writing desk. He opened a drawer, withdrew a folded piece of paper, and read the letter aloud. "I know what you did with the accounts, Edmund. If you don't come clean, I shall." He looked up. "It is signed Philip, your brother-in-law." Edmund didn't flinch. He was bluffing. Poirot smiled faintly. "Then why remove the page from the ledger in your study?" Edmund faltered. "Non," Poirot said gently. "There is more. Much more, but we are not quite ready for the final act." He paused, then continued in his own thoughts. "Human nature, such a curious beast. It lies not to protect the innocent, but to shield the selfish from the mirror." 3 people stood near death, and each believed silence would save them. But time tells its own tale. Unless someone dares to strike it wrong. Outside, the rain turned to hail. Poirot stepped to the window and pulled back the curtain. A figure in a dark coat moved beyond the hedges. Quickly, too quickly. "Inspector," he said calmly, "we are not done. Have someone watch the stables. And make no mistake, our murderer is not just clever. They are rehearsed. Tonight was not improvisation. It was theater." A crash echoed upstairs. Glass. A door slammed. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah," he whispered. "The second act begins." And in the silence that followed, the grandfather clock, whose hands still rested at the wrong hour, ticked once more. Chapter 2. She swore the clock lied. The mirror cracked, not from force, but from the silence that followed Lady Carmichael's voice when she pointed at the clock and declared, "It's lying. That damned clock is lying." Her voice was hoarse, almost feral, the composure of the manners lady fraying like silk under a flame. Poirot, ever composed, did not blink. Instead, he tilted his head just so, like a curious bird studying a dangerous seed. His gaze fixed not on the clock, but on her, reflection in the fractured glass behind it. She was trembling, not from fear, but from something heavier. Panic, perhaps, or guilt. "Madame," Poirot began gently, "a clock is incapable of deceit. It has no motive, but those who touch it, there lies the possibility of a lie most deliberate." She looked away, her arms crossing tightly over her chest as if to defend against a chill no fire could ease. The room, thick with the scent of wax and ash, held its breath. Outside, the wind scraped against the ivy-laced windows, like fingernails across a confession box. It had been one night since the murder. Philip Carmichael's body had been taken from the drawing room, but his presence lingered like smoke. Time had become an unreliable narrator in this house. The grandfather clock had stopped at 10:07. The village bell had struck 11. And now Lady Gwen insisted the clock was wrong. Despite the evidence, despite her previous certainty of discovering the body at 10. Precisely. Poirot's mind ticked faster than any pendulum. Ah, the human mind, it shifts to protect itself. But the lie does not begin in the mouth. It begins with the fear of being caught. He examined her hands again. No tremble now. Too still. Controlled. He noted the newly polished fingernails, done hastily, unevenly. Why prepare hands? No one is meant to see closely, unless they have been somewhere they should not. And still, she clung to her statement. The clock struck 10. When I found him, I heard it. I remember. Poirot glanced at the timepiece again. Then tell me, madame, why was the clock rewound? She faltered. Perhaps a maid. Mademoiselle Hargrove says she does not touch the clocks, and she is most consistent, even in her lies. He watched her face shift, guilt masked as irritation. Down the corridor, Poirot heard the creak of a floorboard and turned. Edmund Vale stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk faintly twitching at the corner of his mouth. Still interrogating the lady of the house, Poirot? Might I remind you, she is grieving. Poirot's expression did not change. Grief does not preclude truth, Monsieur Vale. And you seem curiously unburdened by sorrow. Edmund raised a brow. We were not close, Philip and I. Yet you remain in the house, not in London where your office awaits. I'm ensuring the estate is secured. Someone must. Poirot nodded slowly. Someone must indeed. And the ledgers you attempted to remove from the study drawer, are they secure also? Edmund's eyes flashed, then cooled. I don't know what you're implying. You know precisely. It is only the confession you fear. Poirot returned to the parlor. The gramophone sat silent. A new record lay in the open sleeve. Ravel's Pavane for a Dead Princess. A curious choice, slow, melancholic. He stared at it for a long moment. In the hallway, a door closed with a deliberate click. Poirot moved to follow. At the base of the staircase, Elsie stood frozen, clutching a silver tray. Her eyes flicked upward, then to Poirot. I didn't see you, sir. No. Poirot's voice was soft, but every word pried. You seem to see quite a lot for someone who hears very little. I beg your pardon? He stepped closer. Yesterday, you said the radio covered the thunder. Today, you say you heard Lady Gwen scream before she entered the drawing room. You cannot have both. I must have been mistaken, she whispered. Or rehearsed. Tell me, mademoiselle, did you see who entered the study before the body was found? Her eyes widened. No, sir. No one, Poirot interrupted, except the person who asked for a clean cloth from the linen room, non? The one who sent you away for 15 minutes? She blinked, and the tray trembled. You were manipulated, Elsie. But I do not think you lied of your own accord. Poirot climbed the stairs slowly. At the top landing, the study lay silent once more. A dull rain began against the windows. He examined the bookshelves, specifically the ledger shelf. One book was missing, but not recently. A thin layer of dust clung to the empty space. It had been removed weeks ago. A premeditated act? It is not just a murder, mon Dieu. It is a performance. Every scene arranged, every line rehearsed. Then a sound, a soft scraping behind the drapes. Poirot moved carefully, drew the fabric aside. Behind it, tucked inside the window seat, was a torn page, a fragment of correspondence. The handwriting was careful, elegant, female. He read aloud, "You said the inheritance would be mine, that you'd change the will. You promised me, Gwen." Poirot inhaled slowly. He stared at the words. Betrayal, intimacy, a promise, broken. Back in the sitting room, he confronted Lady Gwen once more. He handed her the note. I don't know where you got this," she said, voice catching. "It's not mine, no? Then perhaps you would like to explain why the writing matches the inscription inside your prayer book." She shook her head, eyes shining with tears. "It's not what you think. Philip was going to leave everything to his charity. He promised he'd reconsider." Poirot nodded. "So you wrote him a letter? A plea?" "Yes. But he never responded. He said he needed time." Poirot's voice was gentle now. "And yet, when he changed the will, you were removed entirely." She closed her eyes. Ah, Poirot thought, there is the face of grief, not of death, but of betrayal. Poirot paced slowly. "You were not in the solarium. You were with him. You argued." She stiffened. "He was alive when I left." Poirot stopped. "No, he was dead, and you moved the body." Gasps. "I found wax beneath his collar. The candle stub you used to examine the document drawer left scorch marks on the desk. The clock did not lie. You did." "But I didn't kill him," she whispered. Poirot smiled faintly. "I believe you." She blinked. "You are guilty, but not of murder." Silence. Poirot turned to Harrow, who had just entered. "The murderer is not Lady Gwen, but someone who knew she'd find the body and benefit from her shock." Poirot's eyes moved to the shadows beyond the doorway. "Come in, Reverend Lee." A gasp from the clergyman. Poirot's voice was calm but unyielding. "You spoke at Philip's last will signing. You knew of his changes, and you, unlike anyone else, stood to lose your charitable trust. A trust now empty, because Philip found out what you had done with the funds." The Reverend's face darkened. "You can't prove. The letter in your fireplace ash, half burned, and the other half is in my pocket." Harrow seized him. Poirot turned one last time to the grandfather clock, ticking once more in its hollow chest. "Time is honest," he murmured, "but those who fear it often try to silence it." And with that, he walked into the rain. Chapter 3. The watch hidden in his shoe. The storm had passed by morning, but the manor still wore the night like a bruise. The study remained sealed, the smell of ash and wax, lingering like breath too long, held. It was Chief Inspector Harrow who found it first. The shoe, removed during the undertaker's preparation and tucked inside it, not visible to the untrained eye, was a gold pocket watch. The face was cracked. The time, 9:32. "It wasn't there before," Harrow said, shaking his head. "I swear to you, Poirot. We searched the body, thoroughly. But this watch, it wasn't in his shoe when we found him." Poirot took the object gently, his gloved fingers tracing its scuffed casing. He did not speak. Not yet. Instead, his mind reeled, like a chessboard, reshuffling itself. Someone placed it there. But why? And more intriguingly, When? Perhaps, Poirot murmured. Someone wanted us to believe he died at a different time. The watch, with its shattered glass and frozen hands, offered a contradiction. Lady Carmichael had sworn she found the body at 10. The grandfather clock had read 10:07. The village bell had struck 11. But this solitary timepiece, hidden so deliberately, introduced a new hour to the chaos. 9:32. Poirot turned to Harrow. We must revisit every statement made, every footprint stepped on the carpet of deceit. Someone is rewriting time, mon ami. With every tick, the truth tries to surface. The household remained tense, coiled like a viper not yet struck. Poirot gathered them in the drawing room again, the stage now dimly lit by the grey light pressing through stained glass windows. Lady Gwen sat rigid, her spine a perfect line of cultivated grief. Edmund Vale, colder now, polished his cufflinks absent-mindedly, his eyes distant, and young Elsie, pale as parchment, avoided everyone's gaze, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "I require your attention," Poirot began, his voice soft, but commanding. "A new complication has arisen. A pocket watch, found inside the late Mr. Carmichael's shoe." Gasps, a stifled breath, and then silence again. Lady Gwen's fingers trembled on the armrest. He never carried that watch. Not since our anniversary. It stopped working. He left it in the drawer for months." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but sentiment is like perfume. It lingers long after it is worn. He may have kept it close, nonetheless. But this concealment, it is no habit. It is a message." Edmund scoffed lightly. "Hidden in a shoe? Really, Poirot? That sounds theatrical, even for Philip." "Oui," Poirot said, "which is precisely why it is meaningful. Theatrics, monsieur, are rarely accidental." The guests murmured among themselves. Poirot stepped forward and placed the watch upon the mantel, where it gleamed in the firelight like a wound. He began to walk, slowly, calmly, his voice guiding their thoughts like a metronome. Imagine the scene. A man is killed. There is chaos, lies whispered like prayers, and someone, afterward, tampers with the body, not to remove a clue, but to plant one. "Are you saying," Lady Gwen whispered, "that someone returned after his death?" Poirot nodded. "Precisely. And that someone wanted us to believe he died at 9:32, but not because it was true, because it would protect them." Elsie burst out. "But that would mean that someone had access to the body after the discovery?" "Oui," Poirot said gently, "and before the undertaker arrived. A narrow window, a daring risk, but a calculated one." He turned toward the fireplace. A scuff mark. Faint. He examined the rug, its fibers disturbed in a curved shape. "Harrow," he called. "What were the positions of the shoes when the body was moved?" "Lying side by side. Loafers. Slightly scuffed. Normal. But not identical," Poirot said. "The left bore more mud. And now we know why. It was removed briefly, then replaced." The guests looked from one another, confusion dawning into suspicion. Poirot tapped the watch. "And now, let us consider motive." He turned first to Edmund. "You stand to gain financially from Philip's death. You lie with ease, monsieur, but not elegantly. The ledger you attempted to remove contains pages rewritten by a second hand." Edmund narrowed his eyes. "I was protecting my sister. Philip's accounts, he was mismanaging everything." Poirot smiled. "How noble But you are not the only one with secrets. He stepped toward Lady Gwen. You loved him, perhaps. Or you hated him, perhaps. Love and hate, they require equal proximity. But you wrote to him, demanding he restore you in his will. You visited his study after dinner. Your scent still lingers on the seat's velvet, but you did not kill him. I swear it, she whispered. I found him already dead. Poirot gave a gentle bow of the head. I believe you. Your grief, madame, is real, but incomplete, because it is mixed with shame. You saw the body, and you touched it, perhaps to move a paper, or a letter you feared others would see. Her voice broke. Yes, I removed the letter, but I didn't harm him. Poirot turned lastly to Elsie. Mademoiselle, he said, you are young. You are afraid, but you are not unwise. You were the last to clean the study, were you not? She nodded. You saw the watch. You knew where he kept it. Her lip trembled. I never touched it. He always kept it in a desk drawer with his cufflinks. Poirot's brow rose. And when did you last see it there? Her silence was the answer. Poirot straightened. Let us move, then, to the final twist. He walked slowly to the piano, placed his hands lightly on the keys, and pressed a single note. This house has a fourth player, someone hiding beneath the floorboards of suspicion. The guests looked around. Lucien, Poirot said, and the room froze. The man emerged from the doorway like a ghost, Philip Carmichael's personal secretary. Previously out of town, now returned. He stood calm, even smug, as though watching a well-rehearsed tragedy reach its climax. I thought you weren't expected until next week, Edmund said sharply. I returned early. I was here that night. Gasps again. Poirot nodded. Indeed. I found your travel case in the guest cottage, half unpacked. You arrived the morning of the murder and stayed quiet, but someone saw your lantern light near the stables. Lucien didn't deny it. Poirot continued. You were dismissed by Philip 3 weeks ago, were you not? Quietly. No letter, no scandal, but you feared it would come, and so you returned, to beg, to blackmail, perhaps both. Lucien's eyes darkened. He was a liar. He ruined people with smiles and apologies. He promised me a future and tore it away for a miscalculation. Poirot nodded solemnly. And so you killed him. And afterward, you returned. Removed the left shoe, hid the watch, to mislead me, to confuse the hour of death, and you succeeded, for a time. I only meant to scare him, Lucien said softly. He laughed at me. Poirot's face did not change. The dead do not laugh, monsieur. They haunt. Lucien was taken away. The others stood still, like statues, history rewritten in their eyes. Poirot picked up the watch one last time. It is strange, he said, almost to himself. A man lives by the ticking of a clock, but he dies when another man decides to silence it. The watch stopped. Then, no more ticking. Chapter 4. The maid knew more than she said. The candle fell from her tray. It rolled across the parquet floor, its flickering flame smearing light over the mahogany walls like a trembling accusation. Elsie froze, her lips parted, her eyes wide, as the flame stuttered, then went out beneath the hem of the heavy green drapes. For a moment, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the next room, and the silence she left behind was louder than any scream. Poirot watched her without moving. His posture was relaxed, his eyes anything but. He bent slowly to retrieve the candle. When he rose, he handed it back to her with deliberate care. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "even the clumsiest hands do not tremble like that unless they carry more than just wax." She said nothing. He smiled gently. "Let us take a little walk, you and I. There is something you are trying very hard not to remember." The hall of Carmichael Manor felt colder than usual. Not because of the weather, which had begun to warm slightly after the storm, but because of something deeper, some current beneath the floors and through the walls that hinted at truths being swallowed rather than spoken. Poirot walked beside the girl with slow, careful steps. She tried to speak, twice, failed both times. Finally, when they reached the garden corridor, a hallway of glass and vines, and the ghost of a summer that never quite returned, she whispered, "I didn't lie, monsieur. I just didn't say everything." "Ah," Poirot said, nodding. "A lie by omission. It is the favorite of the frightened, the ashamed, and the loyal. I do not yet know which you are." She looked down, her hands twisted in her apron. "You knew about the watch," he said. "Yes. You saw someone go into the study after the body was found." She looked up sharply. Poirot nodded. "Of course you did. But more than that, you let them in." "No," she cried. Then softer, "Not at first." "Not at first," Poirot echoed, "but later." A single tear rolled down her cheek. "It wasn't what you think." "Then tell me," he said gently, "because I have thought many things, and none of them end well." And so she did, piece by piece. It began, as it so often does, with something small. A conversation overheard by accident. Philip Carmichael arguing with someone over the telephone in the servants' wing. A conversation that included phrases like embezzlement, influence, and if you say a word, I'll take the whole house down with me. Elsie had thought little of it, until that very night, when she saw a figure in the dark enter the house through the west garden door. It was Lucien, the secretary, but he hadn't come alone. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Go on." "I saw Mr. Vale with him. They argued near the stables, and later, Mr. Vale handed Lucien something. A bag, I think." Poirot stepped back, thoughtful. "Why did you not tell me this sooner?" "I thought they were covering something up, but I didn't think it was murder. I didn't know Philip was dead yet. I only realized what I'd seen after someone asked you to stay quiet." She nodded. "And who was it?" She hesitated. "Lady Gwen." Interesting. And it was, for Gwen had insisted on Lucien's innocence when the man had returned, disheveled and silent. She had defended him, even when Poirot revealed the forged receipts and missing money. And now the girl said Gwen had intercepted her before she could speak to the inspector, told her that saying anything about Lucien's visit would hurt people who didn't deserve it. Ah, Poirot thought, we are coming closer now. The truth is not always hidden in the shadows. It is sometimes stitched into silence. He returned to the study. The scent of polish still clung to the desk. There, in the second drawer, hidden beneath a folded napkin, was what he had hoped not to find. A pair of gloves, fine, silk-lined, and blood-stained at the fingertips. Not enough blood to suggest the killer. No, this was the blood of someone who touched the body after it was already cold. Poirot turned them over. The initials embroidered into the inner lining were subtle, but not invisible. G.C. He laid them down and stared at them for a long time. Then, as if satisfied, he stood. That evening, he called them all to the drawing-room again. The cast of the manor, assembled like suspects on a stage. "I will ask you not to speak," Poirot said calmly, "until I have finished. What I am about to say will not be easy to hear, but it is necessary. For truth, for justice, and for the soul of this house." They were silent. It was Lucien who struck the blow. "That we have established. He came in through the garden, argued with Philip, and in a fit of rage, or perhaps desperation, he pulled the trigger. But that is not the whole truth." He turned to Gwen. "Someone else was there. Someone who came after. Someone who moved the body. Someone who altered the crime scene." Gwen looked up, pale, defiant. "You, madame, were in love with Lucien. Not the sort of love spoken about in parlors, but the quiet, forbidden kind that lives in letters and glances. Philip knew. He confronted you. He threatened to change his will." "I didn't kill him," she said flatly. "I know," Poirot said, "but you did hide the letter. You did touch the body, and you did ask the maid to say nothing." She flinched. Poirot turned now to Edmond Vale. "And you, monsieur, are not innocent either. You had debts. Lucien knew about them, and you paid him, quietly, discreetly, to recover a set of documents Philip had hidden in the estate files." Edmond paled. "You can't prove that." "The maid saw you." Elsie looked down. Poirot stepped forward. "The tragedy, mes amis, is not the death itself. It is what was born after. Lies, silence, cowardice." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope. "And finally, there is this." He opened it, revealing a photograph. Lady Gwen, Lucien, and a child. "Your son," Poirot said softly. "Hidden, secret, protected." Gwen broke. She collapsed into herself. "He was going to take him from me. He said he'd expose everything. My letters, my visits to Lucien in London. He said the child was illegitimate, that he'd ruin us both." Poirot placed the photo on the mantel beside the watch. "And so," he said, "the truth. Lucien killed Philip. Gwen protected Lucien. Vale tried to erase the financial trail. And the maid saw everything, and said nothing." He looked at Elsie. "You were not guilty, but your silence nearly was." Elsie wept. Poirot sighed. "Human nature, Hastings, is the most predictable thing in the world. It longs for love, for wealth, for safety, and when it cannot have them, it lies, it hides, it burns the truth in fire and buries it beneath slippers and silk. And then, as if to punctuate the night, the grandfather clock struck. It rang once, deep, final. Time had spoken, and it would not lie again." Chapter 5. The key that didn't fit. The key turned. Once, then stopped. A sudden metallic resistance echoed like a denial from the past itself. Harrow grunted, twisting harder. "It's the study's drawer. I'm sure of it," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "This is the key we found in Carmichael's pocket." He tried again. Still no yield. Poirot stood beside him, motionless. His eyes were not on the key, nor the drawer. They were fixed, precisely, on the man's hand. Then, slowly, his gaze moved to the edge of the drawer. His voice came softly, like silk wrapping a blade. "Non, mon ami. That is not the key to this drawer. It was placed in his pocket to make us believe it was." He took the key from Harrow and weighed it in his palm. It was heavy, brass, ornate. A false intimacy masked in elegance. A key that whispered its own story. Poirot turned it over once, twice, then glanced at the base of the drawer's lock. "Do you see it?" he murmured, half to himself. "There, just there, scratches, the faintest sign of forced entry. Someone used another instrument first, then left this key to distract us." The silence in the study thickened like fog, curling around old secrets. A single ember hissed in the fireplace. Poirot stepped back. "A man is dead," he said calmly. "A will was changed. A drawer was forced. And now we find a key that fits nowhere." It was not just any drawer. It was that drawer, the one Philip Carmichael kept locked at all hours, the one that, according to Lady Gwen, even she had never seen opened. And yet someone had opened it. Someone had taken something worth killing for. In the hours that followed, Poirot allowed no one rest. The household was summoned one by one. Each guest, each servant, each soul inside that cursed house of ticking clocks and velvet shadows. And each one, in turn, denied knowledge of the drawer, of the key, of what had been inside. But Poirot, always gentle, always exacting, knew how to press the blade without drawing blood. His questions fell like rain, seemingly light, yet unrelenting. "Did you ever see Mr. Carmichael write at this desk? Was this drawer locked when the constable arrived? And you, madame, when did you last see the keyring on which this belonged?" Lady Gwen's voice was brittle. "He never showed me his documents. Philip was private, even with me." Poirot leaned forward. "Yet you recall the exact number of compartments in this desk." She blinked. "Earlier, you mentioned 3 compartments beneath the ledger, one of which is hidden unless the drawer is pulled to its fullest extension. But how would you know that unless you had seen it opened?" I just assumed," she faltered. "No, madame. Assumption is the privilege of the ignorant. Observation is the burden of the guilty." Next came Edmund Vale, calm as ever, but too calm. The sort of stillness that begged to be disrupted. He answered each question without pause, too quickly, too perfectly. Poirot's eyes never left his face. "Do you recognize this key, monsieur?" "I do not, and yet the key bears a tiny stamp, EV engraving, London, Edmund Vale and Sons. A gift shop, is it not?" Edmund's mouth opened, then closed again. "You see," Poirot said smoothly, "the truth is never loud. It speaks only when no one else dares." In the third act of the day, Poirot examined the drawer once more. With care, he removed its contents. Papers, ledgers, a fountain pen, a checkbook. Nothing remarkable, until he ran a finger beneath the velvet lining and felt a click. A hidden compartment. He opened it. Inside, folded in triplicate, was a letter. Poirot unfolded it. It was written in a trembling hand. It was dated 3 weeks before the murder, and it was addressed not to Lady Gwen, nor to Edmund, but to a solicitor in York. In it, Carmichael confessed intentions to dissolve several accounts linked to a charity run by Reverend Lee. The letter hinted at financial impropriety, but more than that, it mentioned a second will, a will not yet signed. Poirot's fingers tightened. He turned to Harrow. "Summon the Reverend." Lee arrived, pale and perspiring. He denied everything, of course, said he knew nothing of the letter, but Poirot, who had studied human weakness in its many forms, saw the truth form behind the man's eyes, like frost on glass. "You visited Philip the week before his death," Poirot said. "You spoke for exactly 9 minutes, and when you left, the servants recall that Philip looked haunted." "I offered him counsel," Lee said quickly. "He was a troubled man." "Yes," Poirot replied, troubled by theft and betrayal, and now by death. The Reverend blanched. As the storm returned outside, low thunder crawling across the fields like a predator, Poirot stood once more before the household. The drawer was forced, he said. The letter was removed, read, then returned by someone who did not wish it destroyed, but hidden. The key in Philip's pocket, a decoy, a planted detail meant to confuse us. His eyes swept the room. Someone knew of the second will. Someone who feared it. Someone who hoped by stealing it or delaying its signature, they might inherit more. He turned to Lady Gwen. You loved him, madame. I believe that. But you feared what might be left to your son. You feared the scandal of Lucian. And so you delayed him. You argued. You slowed the process. Then to Edmund, your debts left you cornered. You manipulated Lucian into confronting Philip. You gave him the forged evidence, hoping he'd pressure Philip, but Lucien lost control. Then Poirot's voice dropped. And the Reverend feared exposure. So he returned to the study after the death, before the police arrived, and planted the key, hoping we'd believe it genuine, hoping the drawer would never be opened. Poirot opened his hand. In it, a second key, similar but subtly different. I found this one hidden beneath a loose tile in the chapel, the real key, and with it, the final truth. He placed it into the drawer's lock. It turned, effortlessly. The compartment within held a second envelope, the unsigned will, dated the morning of the murder, and in it, everything was left to Gwen, with a provision for a boy, named Thomas, her son, Lucien's child. Poirot turned to Gwen, gently now. You were the heir, madame, not through manipulation, but through mercy. He forgave you. He planned to announce the will that evening. She shook with tears. Poirot faced the rest. But 3 men conspired to stop that moment from ever coming. One pulled the trigger, one forged the silence, and one locked the truth away. He closed the drawer. Then, in that heavy, echoing silence, Poirot said, the key was not to the drawer. It was to the lie, and the door it unlocked led to every soul in this room. Just Chapter 6. Her alibi was too timely. The moment Lady Gwen claimed she was in the music room at the time of the murder, the clock in Poirot's mind stopped ticking. Not because the statement was suspicious in content, it was all too ordinary, but because of the manner in which it was delivered. Too precise, too polished, like a script rehearsed once too often. She had said it with her chin lifted, her voice flat, her eyes unblinking. At 9:15, I was with Mrs. Danforth, in the music room. We played through the first movement of the sonata, then had tea. You may ask her. It was the kind of alibi that should reassure, but it didn't. Not to Poirot, not to a man who once said, the liar tries to remember too much. The truth is always simple. He said nothing at first, only nodded politely, then turned away to look out the window as the rain lashed down in sheets. But in his silence, something dangerous began to form, because Poirot did not believe in coincidences, and he certainly did not believe in musical timings being quite so fortuitous. The crime itself was already a complex knot of broken timepieces, altered wills, and secrets folded like notes inside teacups. Philip Carmichael had been found dead in his study. The supposed time of death centered around the grandfather clock's frozen hands and a concealed watch. But now, Lady Gwen was introducing something new, a movement of music, a specific length of performance. Witness too willing. Poirot stepped into the music room that evening. The light was low. A single candle burned near the sheet stand. The grand piano's lid was closed, but dust had not yet settled on the keys. He pressed one note. It echoed long and low. From the far end of the room, Mrs. Danforth emerged. "Such a mournful sound," she said, her voice quivering. "It suits the house now." "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "Tell me, madame, you and Lady Gwen played the sonata together?" "Yes. She plays quite well, at least well enough to carry the first movement." "And you played together from 9:15 precisely?" Her eyes narrowed. "That's what she said." Poirot tilted his head. "It is what she claimed. But I ask you what you remember." Mrs. Danforth hesitated. Yes, I think that's right. We started just after the clock struck. Then we stopped for tea." "Was the tea already waiting?" "No. Gwen rang for it after we played." Poirot nodded. "Then you had time to speak, time to reflect, time to check the hour again?" She frowned. "We may have looked at the mantel clock when the tea arrived. It was nearly 10, I think. I'm not sure." Poirot smiled. "Merci, madame. You have been most helpful." But in his mind, the doubts were no longer whispers. They were cathedral bells. Lady Gwen had been counting on precision. But real memories do not move with such elegance. They stutter, they hesitate, they contradict themselves. Later that evening, Poirot returned to the study. Harrow was there, reviewing the drawer contents again, searching for a missing document Carmichael's solicitor had hinted at. A codicil, perhaps, or a letter. "Any luck?" Poirot asked. "None," Harrow replied. "It's as if the paper evaporated." Poirot looked at the desk. "Non, mon ami. It did not vanish. It was taken. Perhaps by someone with music in her alibi." Harrow blinked. "You think Lady Gwen took it?" "I think," Poirot said, moving toward the fireplace, "that she wished to prove herself elsewhere, at precisely the moment she knew something important would happen here." He bent down. On the hearth, nestled between a brass poker and a spill of ash, was a small object, a piano metronome weight, slightly blackened by soot. Poirot held it up. "Interesting. This does not belong in the study." He placed it carefully on the mantel. "Someone brought this in. Perhaps to set a scene. Perhaps to cover a sound." He turned now toward the door. "I shall speak with Lady Gwen again." This time, her demeanor was different, less icy, more deliberate. She stood near the window in her dark gown, the rainlight catching in the beading of her sleeves. "Is it about the music?" she asked. "It is." She did not look surprised. "I knew it would be." "Madame," Poirot said, stepping forward, "you are intelligent. You understand how long a movement lasts. You knew Mrs. Danforth would confirm it. But the piano in that room, it is untuned." She blinked. "I press the keys. Some ring too sharp. Others are dull. You cannot play a precise piece without noticing. Yet neither of you mentioned it." She said nothing. Poirot continued, "And you knew the tea would be late, because the kitchen clock is 5 minutes slow. You rang for it after, not before, meaning you had time to do something else." "Such as?" "Such as burn a page." He stepped closer. "There was soot on your gloves, the same soot that dusted the metronome weight you brought into the study to muffle the echo of a gunshot." She turned slowly. "And yet you believe I didn't kill him." "I do," Poirot said, "but you moved something from the scene, and you buried it with silence." She looked down. "He was going to change everything." "I know." I didn't want him dead, but I couldn't let that document be found. Not if it meant Lucien. Poirot finished softly. She nodded, and the child. Poirot's eyes were kind, but his voice was iron. And so, you gave yourself an alibi. Not to cover a murder, but to cover your theft. And now, madame, the question is not whether you are guilty of the crime, but whether you understand how closely your lie invited suspicion of a worse one. She sank into the chair. He turned, then stopped. There is one more thing, he said. He withdrew from his pocket the envelope Carmichael had hidden in the clock's casing. The real document, the original will, unburned. How did you... He planned ahead, Poirot said. He did not trust drawers. He trusted time. He laid the document on the desk. Your alibi was too timely, madame, because you knew when something mattered, but you forgot why it mattered. She did not reply. Poirot stepped into the hall, where Harrow waited. Well, the inspector asked. She did not kill him, but she made sure someone else could, or at the very least, did not stop. Do we charge her? Poirot looked back through the door. No, we let the truth haunt her. It will be heavier than iron bars. Outside, the rain finally ceased. A faint hush settled over the manor, but inside, the echo of a lie timed too perfectly lingered like the last note of a sonata unfinished. And Poirot, ever calm, ever knowing, whispered to himself, "The truth, mon ami, is not what people say. It is when they say it." Chapter 7. The fireplace was still warm. The ashes hadn't cooled. That was the first thing Poirot noticed when he entered the study for the third time that morning. The rest of the house had fallen into that quiet, fraying rhythm that follows a death too full of questions. But in this room, this theatre of lies masquerading as a gentleman's retreat, something refused to settle. Kneeling beside the hearth, Poirot extended a gloved hand and hovered it over the blackened coals. It was unmistakable. Heat. Not imagined, not residual from the day before. Someone had lit this fire after Philip Carmichael was already dead, and they had done it to hide something. He stood slowly, adjusting the lapels of his grey suit. The light through the study's high windows was grey and wet, casting long shadows that moved like smoke across the Persian rug. Poirot's eyes narrowed on a peculiar dark smear upon the stone just beyond the grate. Burnt paper, partially crumpled and singed at the edge. He plucked it with tweezers and held it to the light. "Ah," he murmured, "even fire cannot consume the truth if one knows where to look." It was only a fragment, but even fragments speak. The ink had bled into the grain, but one line, one cursed line, remained. "And if you fail to comply, I shall be forced to..." Forced to what? To expose? To ruin? To disinherit? Poirot folded the paper delicately and slipped it into a pouch inside his coat. This was not an accident. This was intent. He exited the study with the precision of a man stepping from one performance into another. The corridor was quiet, but not empty. Elsie, the maid, stood at the far end, dusting picture frames that had already been polished 3 times today. She watched him as he passed. Nervous. Always nervous, that girl. The fire told him one thing. Someone returned to the study after Philip was already dead. That, in itself, was not unusual. But the fire was recent, too recent. No one had admitted to it, and only 3 people had access after the constable locked the door. Lady Gwen, under the excuse of retrieving correspondence. Edmund Vale, who claimed he never stepped foot inside again, and Reverend Lee, whose presence remained unexplained entirely, save for a muttered prayer. In the drawing room, Poirot found them all, as if fate had kindly gathered the suspects for him. Lady Gwen, dressed in mourning silk, her hands folded too, tightly. Edmund, his expression a mask chiseled from frost. The Reverend, pale and still, seated as if afraid the floor beneath him might give way. "I have a question," Poirot said softly. "Who lit the fire in the study after the constable left?" 3 expressions, none matching the others. Gwen blinked, then frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot stepped further in. "The fireplace. The coals are still warm. Someone burned something in there, recently." Edmund scoffed. "And how do you know it wasn't Philip himself before he died?" "Because," Poirot said, smiling faintly, "he was shot in the back. He fell forward. Had he tended the fire before, there would be soot on his sleeves. There was none." Reverend Lee cleared his throat. "Surely the maid—" "No," Poirot said. "Mademoiselle Elsie was in the kitchen, as confirmed by 2 staff members and a clock that, while a few minutes off, still tells us much. Non, monsieur. Someone lit the fire to destroy a document, and I would very much like to know what that document contained." There was a pause. Gwen stood slowly. "I did go in, I admit it. I wanted to see if Philip had left any letters for me." "He had," Poirot interrupted. "But you did not find them, did you? Because they had already been removed, and one, partially burned, was left behind. A blackmail letter, I suspect, or worse. The question is, who was it addressed to?" Now the tension was a living thing. Poirot moved, closer to Edmund Vale. "You, monsieur, had motive. You knew about the hidden accounts. You knew Lucien had found out." Edmund's face hardened. "And you think I murdered him to keep a secret?" Poirot shrugged. "No, you are not brave enough. But you are desperate enough to forge, to bribe, to mislead." Then he turned to the Reverend. "And you, Monsieur Lee, have lied at least once. You told me you left the house at 8:30, but the stable boy saw you near the garden gate at 9:15. Care to explain?" The Reverend's mouth opened and closed. I returned to fetch my umbrella. I didn't want to disturb anyone." Poirot raised a brow. "How considerate." Yet the umbrella was still in the vestibule, dry. The silence in the room deepened. He walked slowly to the fireplace in the drawing room. "You see," he said, "this is the problem with lies. They require choreography, and you are poor dancers." Poirot paused, then turned to Gwen once more. "Madame, do you recall what you wore that night?" "My black velvet dress." "Why?" He nodded. "Yes, with the silver clasp at the throat. But the one you wore the night before, blue satin, yes? It is missing." She faltered. "I believe it was used to wrap something, perhaps the original copy of the will, or a confession." Edmund stepped forward. "This is absurd. You're throwing accusations like confetti." Poirot's tone never changed. "Because the truth is that someone in this house set the fire not out of rage, but out of calculation. And I know who it was." He stepped to the door. "Madame Danforth," he called. The pianist entered, her steps cautious. "You remember," Poirot said, "the song you played for Lady Gwen?" "Yes." "At what time?" "Just before 10. We finished at 10:10. I remember because the clock chimed." Poirot turned back to Gwen. "Madame, you said you were with her from 9:15 to 10, and yet you were seen entering the study at 9:45. The hallway mirror captured your reflection. Gwen's face drained of color. You followed me? No, he said, but the maid was polishing the mirror, and she saw you pass. Twice. Now she shook. You destroyed the letter because it named you, because Philip knew about Lucien, knew the child was his. You were to be disinherited. And that letter? It was your final leverage. Poirot moved forward. But here is the twist, madame. The letter was not addressed to Philip Carmichael. It was written by him, and it was to you. It was a plea, a reconciliation. He knew, and he forgave you. Gwen's hands flew to her mouth. She crumpled to the floor, sobbing. Poirot stood still. She burned it not to hide her guilt, he said, but because she could not bear its mercy. The Reverend exhaled slowly. Then who killed him? Poirot looked to the fire. A man who feared no letters, only exposure. His gaze landed on Edmund. You knew about the new will. You followed Philip that night, and you shot him. The rest, Lady Gwen's mistakes, they covered your crime for you. Poirot withdrew the pistol from beneath the study desk, where it had been returned. Your fingerprints, monsieur. They are quite telling. And as Harrow entered to make the arrest, Poirot said quietly, the fireplace was still warm, because even in death, the truth burns hotter than any flame. Chapter 8. One photograph was missing. The frame was there. The dust line confirmed it. Between the portrait of Philip Carmichael's late mother and the oil-painted hunting scene above the fireplace, a small rectangular void sat on the mantelpiece like a scream no one had heard. Poirot did not need to ask whether something had been removed. The dust spoke louder than any servant. He stared at it in silence, the silence only interrupted by the slow, echoing tick of the grandfather clock behind him, counting down a truth someone had tried to erase. One photograph was missing, Poirot whispered to himself, and that, mon ami, is far more telling than all the ones left behind. It had taken him this long to notice it, because everything else had been so loud. The will, the forged letter, the fire. But this was a deletion, a choice. Not chaos, but curation. Someone had not only removed the photograph, but ensured the space remained unfilled. Why not cover the gap? Rearrange the remaining portraits? No. Whoever did this wanted the absence to be noticed, or had been in too much of a rush to conceal it properly. And in Poirot's experience, rushed cover-ups often reveal more than slow confessions. He knelt to inspect the edge of the mantelpiece. A thin smear of oil on the wood's edge. A fingerprint, perhaps, smudged, left-handed, unthinking. The photograph had meant something dangerous. In the drawing room, Lady Gwen sat curled near the window, clutching her gloves as if they tethered her to the earth. Poirot entered gently, his footfalls soft against the thick rug. "Madame," he said, "you kept the photographs there yourself?" "Yes," she said softly. "Philip insisted on displaying family. He hated blank walls." Poirot nodded. "So you dusted them? Rearranged them when they fell askew?" She hesitated. "Sometimes. There was a photo missing. A small one. Not recent. Perhaps sepia-toned. You know the one, don't you?" She looked away. "It was nothing." "Ah," Poirot smiled. "Then it is most certainly not nothing." She bit her lip. It was a photograph of Philip and Lucien, taken at university. They were close once. Close enough to keep on the mantel. "I told him to take it down," she said quietly. "After everything, with Lucien, I couldn't bear to see it any more. Poirot tilted his head. Yet you did not remove it yourself. I tried. He wouldn't let me. But someone else has. She swallowed. I suppose they have. In the hallway, Poirot passed Edmund Vale, speaking in hushed tones with Reverend Lee. The two men separated quickly as he approached. Guilty men always make room for witnesses. He paused before them. Gentlemen, tell me, have either of you ever posed for a photograph with Mr. Carmichael? Lee shook his head quickly. No, I was never that close with him. He distrusted the clergy, privately. And you, Monsieur Vale? Edmund gave a tight smile. Too many, I'm sure. Philip loved his camera. Poirot smiled. And yet only one photograph is missing. Curious, is it not? He watched Edmund's jaw clench, then release. A muscle ticked at his temple. That evening, Poirot requested the maid to bring down the household's photo albums from the upstairs study. They were brittle, yellowed, heavy with memories. He flipped through page after page, each carefully labeled in Philip's neat cursive. Vienna, 1934, yacht trip, Cornwall. Gwen's birthday. Then, near the back, Cambridge, 1928. The page was torn, ragged at the spine. The photo once glued there had been removed. But not recently. No. This tear had age. Poirot turned to Harrow, who hovered at his shoulder. Do you see? A missing photo? Harrow asked. Non, Poirot said. A premeditation. He walked to the fireplace again and examined the spacing. The frame was removed recently, but the idea, the motive, it was planted long ago. The next morning, Poirot requested something unusual. He asked that the old housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, be brought to him. She was near retirement, quiet, barely involved in the household politics. But she had been with the Carmichaels for decades. He spoke with her alone, in the servants' parlour. Madame Linton, forgive me, but I must ask, was there ever something between Philip and Lucienne? The old woman's eyes flickered. Then, very slowly, she nodded. They were close. Closer than men were supposed to be in those days. Philip's father disapproved, sent Lucienne away. Did Lady Gwen know? She hesitated. She suspected, but she never asked. And Philip, he never spoke of it, not after the engagement. Poirot closed his eyes. Ah, the symmetry of secrets. A child born in silence, a love buried beneath duty, and a murder that dug it all back up. He stood. Merci, madame. You have done more than you know. Poirot gathered the household once more. He paced slowly before the hearth, holding the photograph frame, now empty. You all see this space, do you not? He began. A small thing. The absence of an image. And yet, it tells a story louder than any confession. He turned to Gwen. You wanted it removed. Yes. He turned to Edmund. You feared what it revealed. No, I didn't even know which photo was gone. Poirot stepped forward. But you knew what it meant. Then, to Reverend Lee. You, counseled Philip. Yes, but what did you counsel him against? Lee looked down. Poirot's voice grew colder. Against changing the will. Against acknowledging Lucien's place in this house. Against truth. Lee swallowed. I feared the consequences, for the reputation of the family. Poirot nodded. Ah, yes. The reputation, and for that, you betrayed him. He opened a small envelope. The burned letter from the fireplace. It was a confession, not of a crime, but of a love. Philip intended to leave everything to Gwen and her son. and to posthumously name Lucien as the father. The photograph, the will, the letters, they were his last attempt at peace. Poirot turned to Edmond. You destroyed them. You convinced Lucien he had no hope. You orchestrated his anger. And when he confronted Philip, you followed him in. And when Lucien fled in panic after the shot, you ensured Philip would not recover. Gasps. Poirot held up a photograph. Recovered from Lucien's cottage, the twin to the missing one. Philip and Lucien, side by side, arms around each other, smiling. It was love, and you made it shame. Edmond stepped back. He was going to ruin the family. No, Poirot said, you did that. And as Harrow placed him under arrest, Poirot turned back to the empty frame. One photograph was missing, and with it, the heart of the truth. But what a man tries to burn in life, Poirot said softly, he resurrects in death. Chapter 9. He smiled before saying the time. He smiled. That, more than anything, unnerved the girl. Not the creak of the floorboard, not the shadow that moved too slowly in the hallway mirror, not even the heavy silence that followed the gunshot upstairs. No, what haunted Elsie later, as she sobbed behind the locked pantry door, was the way Mr. Edmund Vale had smiled just before glancing at the grandfather clock and saying, 10 o'clock, precisely. That smile didn't belong in a house with blood on the banister and a body cooling beside the fire. It was small, satisfied, cold, like a lock clicking shut from the inside. Poirot stood in the foyer the next morning, precisely where Edmund had stood the night before, and faced the tall, carved clock. Its chime had been muted, deliberately. The winding key had been removed. The pendulum still swung, but the chime was silenced. Curious, very curious. A man makes a performance of time only when he wishes others to see what he sees, Poirot murmured. Or rather, what he wants them to believe. The murder had happened in the study. Philip Carmichael, struck down by a single bullet to the spine, falling without resistance. But now, the question of when grew more poisonous than the question of who. Lady Gwen insisted it had been after 10. The maid swore she saw Edmund walking out of the study just before 10. And yet, the body's position, the candles burn, the soot in the fireplace, they all whispered a different hour. Poirot turned to Elsie, who was pale and still shaken. Mademoiselle, he said gently, when Mr. Vale said the time, did he check his watch? No, she whispered. He just looked at the clock and smiled. Bon, Poirot said softly. That tells me everything. In the dining room, Edmund Vale poured himself tea with the ease of a man above suspicion. He looked up as Poirot entered, eyes calm, fingers steady. I assume you have more questions, he said. Only one, Poirot replied. Why did you tamper with the grandfather clock? Edmund's smile didn't waver. I haven't touched it. Then someone has done so on your behalf, Poirot said smoothly, because the chime was disabled after Philip's death. To silence the truth. Edmund stirred his tea. Perhaps the mechanism jammed. No, Poirot said. It was muted on purpose, and you are the only person who gained from the moment it struck 10. Poirot began to pace, slow and measured. You see, monsieur, the fireplace told me when he died. The photograph told me why. The letter told me what was at stake. But time told me who. Edmund's fingers tightened slightly around his cup. Poirot's voice remained calm. You staged it perfectly. The shot fired at 9:38. You returned to the hallway at 9:45. You stood in front of the clock. Then you waited for exactly 15 minutes. Why? Edmund said nothing. Poirot stepped closer. Because you needed someone to witness you saying the time. You needed the maid to remember it, so that when the constable asked, you could say, 10 o'clock, I was by the clock. Ask the girl, and she would. Edmund stood abruptly. This is absurd. Is it? Poirot said. Then explain the ink on your cuff, identical to the ink inside Philip's safe, where he kept the new will. A will you claim never to have seen. Edmund took a step back. Poirot continued, his tone sharpening. Explain the soot on your right shoe, the ash on your sleeve, the weight from the clock found in your coat pocket, used to wedge the pendulum so it would not tick while you altered the hands. Edmund's face was hard now. You have no proof. But I do, Poirot said, because while you smiled at the clock, someone else was watching. He turned to the door. From the hall, Reverend Lee entered, face pale. I saw him, the Reverend said quietly. I came to speak with Philip about the inheritance. He had promised a donation to the orphanage. I waited in the corridor. I saw Edmund go in. I heard the shot, and then I watched him come out and stand at the clock and smile. You should have said something, Poirot said gently. I was afraid, Lee confessed, afraid of what would come out. Poirot turned to Edmund. You gambled, monsieur. You thought controlling the time would control the story. But time, like guilt, does not bend to the will. It only waits. He walked to the clock and gently pushed the pendulum. It began to tick again, once, twice, 3 times. Poirot turned. Arrest him, he said. As Harrow stepped forward, Edmund gave a final smirk. All this for a smile? No, Poirot said. All this because it was the wrong smile. A smile before the time was spoken is confidence. A smile after is triumph. But a smile before is rehearsal. Poirot stared at the clock one last time. Human beings lie about where they were, who they loved, what they feared, but never, he whispered, never do they lie convincingly about when, because time, messieurs, is the only witness that never forgets. Chapter 10. The will was backdated. The ink was too dry. That, above all else, was what betrayed the forgery. Not the paper, which had been cut from the same cream-laid stock as the original. Not the handwriting, which mimicked Philip Carmichael's precise loops, with an almost reverent patience. Not even the seal, which bore the family crest, perfectly pressed in blood-red wax. No, it was the ink. Too faded, too flat, too obedient to time. It was a lie that aged itself prematurely, and to Hercule Poirot, lies that tried too hard to be old were simply young. The solicitor, Mr. Braithwaite, handed Poirot the document with the stiffness of a man who had just realized he might be holding a loaded weapon. This was found in Mr. Carmichael's safe after his death, he said quietly. Unwitnessed, but dated. April 4th, 3 weeks before he died. Poirot nodded, taking the document delicately. Merci, monsieur. But you did not authenticate this before announcing it to the family? Braithwaite looked ashamed. The household was pressing for answers. There was confusion. 2 prior wills, a mention of a revised version. I thought... You thought wrong, Poirot said, voice sharp enough to slice the room in half. A will, monsieur, is a final act. But when that act is written, after the curtain has fallen, that is when the murderer takes their bow. He turned from the solicitor and walked to the tall window, where the rain patterned the glass like tears. Someone else forgot to cry. In the reflection, he saw the study, the same room where Philip Carmichael had written the true version of his will, and the same room where someone had forged a second backdated draft to benefit from his silence. And who gained from this forgery? Lady Gwen, who stood to lose everything if Philip exposed her affair. Edmund Vale, whose gambling debts had grown teeth. Reverend Lee, whose orphanage ledger contained entries for donations never received. All had motive, all had lied, but one had known the precise way a signature fades over weeks, not days. Poirot walked back to the desk. He turned the document over. He held it to the light. Then he pulled from his coat pocket the letter he had retrieved from behind the clock casing the day before. Philip's final handwritten note, addressed to his solicitor, undated but unmistakably recent. The handwriting matched. Too well. That was the danger of perfect mimicry. It erased personality. And Poirot knew. The real Philip had written with passion. The forger had written with restraint. He summoned the household again. Lady Gwen was pale, tired, her eyes rimmed with secrets she no longer had the strength to keep. Edmund Vale had traded arrogance for caution. His usual smirk was replaced by something more reptilian. And the Reverend, always neat, always composed, now looked like a man who had confessed everything but what mattered most. Poirot stood before the fireplace. The clock ticked. The fire crackled. Rain whispered against the windows. "I have here," Poirot began, "a will. It is a clever will, a quiet will, a will that appears at first glance to be valid and proper, but it is not." No one moved. Poirot continued, his tone sharpening. "Because the will was not signed 3 weeks ago. It was signed after the murder, and then it was backdated." Lady Gwen stiffened. "But I thought the April will was the final one. Philip told me he was making changes." "And he did," Poirot said, "but this is not his will. This is a false one, a copy, a manipulation." He turned to Braithwaite. "May I?" The solicitor handed him the ink blotter from Philip's desk. Poirot pressed a fresh sheet against the residue and held it up. "No blot of the new will's date exists here. No impression of the day it claims to have been signed. But look here." He flipped to another sheet. "We find the residue of Philip's true letter, dated the day of his death." He turned to Edmund. "You tampered with the safe, did you not?" Edmund's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but not mine. The maid saw you in the study at dawn before the constable arrived. You claimed you were searching for Gwen's scarf. Elsie, standing in the corner, looked down. Poirot pressed on. But what you removed was not a scarf. It was the unsigned will. You destroyed it. And when the family began asking questions, you panicked." He turned now to Reverend Lee. "But you, monsieur, had access to old paper, did you not? You drafted parish letters for years. You kept the old press. You copied Philip's writing more than once for ceremonial statements. And you, too, stood to gain. The backdated will restored your orphanage funding. The signature, it was yours in style, but Philip's in name." The Reverend's breath caught. Poirot's voice lowered. "You did not kill him, but you sanctified the lie." Lee whispered. "I thought it would do good." Poirot stared at him coldly. It did evil in a very convincing disguise. Then, quietly, Poirot laid the forged will upon the desk and placed beside it the real document. It was signed not in April, but on the morning of Philip's death. It named Lady Gwen and her son as sole heirs. No donations to the Reverend, no safety net for Edmund. He turned back to the room. This was Philip Carmichael's final choice, and someone tried to unmake it after he could no longer speak. But as I have said before, time does not lie. Only those who think themselves smarter than time attempt to forge its memory. Lady Gwen stepped forward. So who forged it? Edmund or the Reverend? Poirot hesitated. Then, from his coat, he produced one last item, a fountain pen. Philip's. Inside, Poirot said, I found ink, wet, fresh, from the day of his death. A test confirmed the chemical composition is different than the ink used on the forged will. He turned to Braithwaite. You keep records, yes? The solicitor nodded. And the ink in your office matches that used in the forgery. Now, Braithwaite turned white. You, Gwen gasped. Poirot's voice was velvet and steel. Yes, the solicitor. You had access, you had knowledge, and you had debts. More than even Edmund. You forged the will to balance your own books. Braithwaite staggered backward. Poirot did not flinch. You gambled on ambiguity, on grief. You expected the family to fight over the contents. You thought no one would question a loyal solicitor. Braithwaite's voice cracked. I didn't kill him. I only gave the family what they wanted. No, Poirot said. You gave them a fiction. And in doing so, you almost gave a murderer a way out. Poirot walked to the fireplace, watching the flames flicker. A man's legacy is not what he writes, but what he dares to leave behind. Philip dared to tell the truth. Others tried to rewrite him. He turned, his eyes glittering. But as you see, truth, once written, is not so easily erased. The room fell silent as Braithwaite was led away. Rain continued to tap against the windows. The house, once filled with lies, now sat still in its quiet reckoning. And Poirot, as always, was the last to speak. A will may be forged, but the intentions of a man, those are written in a different kind of ink, the kind that stains every soul it touches. Chapter 11. Her gloves were still damp. The gloves were damp when she handed them to the maid. Not from rain, the skies had cleared an hour before. Not from spilled tea or nervous perspiration. No, this dampness had a chill to it, a clinging weight, the kind that came not from weather or emotion, but from water drawn from the earth, from something washed or something drowned. And as Elsie folded them over her arm with a shiver, Poirot, standing at the far end of the corridor, caught the faintest scent of lavender soap and bleach. It was then that he knew the final act had begun. He had long suspected that the murder of Philip Carmichael was not one of passion nor panic. No, it had always been a crime of layers, designed not to conceal a motive, but to create too many: a false will, a forged photograph, a silenced clock. But now, in that ordinary moment, the handing of gloves to a maid, Hercule Poirot had found his pivot. Because no woman removes her gloves in a hallway unless she wishes to be seen doing so, and no woman offers wet gloves to a servant unless she has something to hide about where they've been. Lady Gwen sat alone in the small parlour that overlooked the rose garden, a book unopened in her lap. Her posture was rigid, yet the corner of her mouth quivered as Poirot entered. She did not rise. "Have you come to accuse me again?" she asked. Poirot gave a small bow. "I have come only to ask questions. Always, I ask questions, and yet the answers don't seem to matter." "Au contraire, madame. It is only the right answer that matters. And today, I believe, I am close. He seated himself across from her. Your gloves, he said. She blinked. What about them? They were damp. Recently, and not from rain. From soap. Astringent soap. Perhaps I washed my hands. Ah, Poirot said softly, but gloves do not become damp from washed hands. Only when they themselves are washed. And who, madame, washes? Gloves? Gwen said nothing. Poirot leaned in. Lady Gwen, your gloves were damp with water from the manor's service basin, the one used to clean evidence. Blood, if necessary, ink even, and perhaps gunpowder. She stiffened. I did not kill him, she said. You know I didn't. Poirot nodded gently. Yes, I believe you did not, but I also believe you know who did. From the hall came the soft strike of footsteps. Poirot turned his head slightly. Edmund Vale stood in the doorway. You'll get nothing out of her, Edmund said. She's suffered enough. Oui, Poirot replied, but suffering is not always the result of innocence. He stood, walked past Edmund, and ascended the stairs toward the study. The air on the second floor was thick. It always was, in houses where grief and guilt drifted just above eye level. In the study, Poirot knelt once again by the fireplace. He reached behind the small trunk where kindling was kept and pulled free a small cloth, crumpled, stiff, and faintly reeking of lye. It had been used to wipe something. A weapon, perhaps. A surface. He laid it flat on the desk. The weave was fine, monogrammed in faint embroidery. G. C. Gwen Carmichael. Poirot returned downstairs and asked for Mrs. Danforth to be summoned. The pianist entered in black, her hands folded like sheets of old music. She took the seat across from him with slow precision. You and Lady Gwen are close, he said. She's a friend, Danforth said cautiously. And friends confide in one another? Not always. No, Poirot smiled, but often enough. She told you where she was that night, did she not? She said she was with me, and she was. Poirot nodded. And when she left you, where did she go? I don't know. Ah, but you do. She went to the stables. She met someone there. And then, I believe, she returned to the study. Danforth's mouth opened, then shut. Her eyes dropped. It was Lucien, she whispered. He came back. Gwen met him. I didn't want to lie, but she begged me not to say. Poirot folded his hands. Merci, madame. You have done the right thing. He turned now to Inspector Harrow, who had been waiting in the drawing-room with quiet dread. The gloves, Poirot said, were washed to remove the residue of gun oil. Lady Gwen did not fire the weapon, but she held it and she moved it. Harrow frowned. Why? Because she found it after the shot. Lucienne dropped it in shock. She panicked. She did not want anyone to know he had returned. She feared what it would mean. So she picked it up, wiped it, hid it. And the gloves? She forgot, or perhaps believed they were dry enough, but they were not, and they betrayed her. The household was called together one final time. The drawing-room seemed smaller than ever, the air thick with what everyone knew must come. Poirot stood before them. Philip Carmichael was murdered, but the murder was not about wealth, nor even about betrayal. It was about legacy, about fear, and about shame. He turned slowly. Lady Gwen did not kill her husband, nor did Lucien. The shot came from outside the study, from the garden terrace, fired through the open window. He stepped forward. It was you, Reverend Lee. The man paled. You feared what Philip's confession would do. You knew the new will would expose not only Lucien's child, but your own falsified charity ledgers. The orphanage had become a funnel for debt. You tried to convince him to delay. When he refused, you waited in the garden, watching the light in the study. And when Lucien arrived, you saw your moment. Poirot's voice grew colder. You fired. One shot. Lucien fled. Gwen entered moments later. You, Reverend, went back to the chapel and burned your robe. Its sleeve bore gunpowder stains. You wore it only for that night's visit, and no one thought to ask. The Reverend said nothing. Poirot turned to Gwen. You saw him, didn't you? She nodded. Yes. Through the window, I saw the flash, and I recognized his silhouette. But I couldn't believe it. Poirot closed his eyes. You washed the gloves, but the truth, it lingered. Reverend Lee was taken away in silence. Gwen sat, still as stone. Poirot stood alone by the hearth, the monogrammed gloves in his hand. Her gloves were still damp, he said softly, and so was the lie she tried to dry with them. But as with all things, even dampness leaves a trace. Chapter 12. Time ran out at the door. The knock never came. That was what Elsie would remember most. The sound that should have been there, and wasn't. The final chance. The interruption that never happened. One moment, the house was full of ticking clocks, echoing footsteps, murmured arguments behind doors. The next, silence had collapsed over it like snow. And when she opened the study door just after midnight, the room was still, the fire was dying, and Philip Carmichael was already gone. Downstairs, Hercule Poirot stood in front of the front door, unmoving. The air in the hall was thick with wood polish and rain, and on the tiled floor, just in front of the threshold, a smear of dried mud. Small, unnoticed by all but the most meticulous eye. Poirot bent down slowly, touched a gloved finger to it, and brought it close. Mon Dieu, he whispered. Too late. By only minutes. He rose, eyes narrow, mind already assembling the scene backwards. The front door had not been opened since before the body was found, and yet someone had stood here. Someone muddy, rushing, perhaps hesitant. Someone who arrived only to find the deed already done, or to find it not yet done, but their moment already lost. It was the final piece of a puzzle, 10 chapters in the making. The clocks, the will, the photograph, the gloves, the missing page, all led here. Poirot turned to Inspector Harrow, who had just come from the back of the house. The stable. Boy saw a man come to the house around 11:50, Harrow said. Tall, coat with a torn collar. He didn't knock, just stood here, then left. Poirot nodded, because he knew. It was too late. He turned from the door and entered the drawing room where Lady Gwen, Edmund Vale, and Reverend Lee had been assembled under Harrow's order. None spoke. The rain whispered behind the windows, and the fire offered no warmth. Let us speak plainly, Poirot began. Philip Carmichael died. Between 11 and midnight, a single shot, no forced entry, no struggle. But every element surrounding his death was controlled by someone else. Not just a murder, but a production. One person wrote the script, the rest performed. Edmund scowled. And who, pray, do you think was the director of this little play? Poirot smiled faintly. The man who arrived too late to stop it. He stepped to the fireplace, retrieving from the mantel the last of Philip's letters, unposted, half-burnt, retrieved from the fireplace's ash the morning after. In this letter, Poirot said, Philip prepared to confess everything. To Gwen, to Lucienne, to the world. He had accepted the past, the child, the betrayal. He was ready to leave his fortune to Gwen and to acknowledge what he had once hidden. He turned to Gwen, her face pale and unreadable. "And you, madame, you had finally convinced him to do so. That was the night's purpose. You and he were to meet in the study alone." She nodded slowly. "I never got there. Someone had already locked the door." "Not locked," Poirot said. "Blocked." He walked to the bookshelf and pressed one panel. A hidden latch clicked. The shelf pivoted inward. Reverend Lee flinched. "Yes," Poirot said. "A second entry, known only to Philip and, until recently, one other." He stared directly at Lee. "You followed him through the garden entrance. You knew of the confession, knew the inheritance would expose your theft, and so you cornered him, but you hesitated because you knew someone else was coming." I didn't kill him," Lee said softly. "No," Poirot agreed. "You merely left the door ajar. You made it easy." He stepped forward. But the shot came not from Lee, not from Lucien, who arrived just after. It came from you, Edmund. Edmund froze. You were upstairs. In the hallway, you had watched Philip prepare the documents for days. You waited, and, when Lucien failed to arrive in time to interrupt, you took the moment yourself. You descended, entered the hidden passage, shot him, planted the old will, then left through the servants' corridor. "That's madness," Edmund hissed. "No," Poirot said calmly. "It is method, it is fear, and it is guilt." He turned, retrieving from his pocket a small gold pen. This pen was dropped near the cellar door. A gift. Your initials engraved. The ink inside matches the forged will's signature. You signed it after the murder, then backdated it to match the original. Lady Gwen stood slowly. Philip was trying to fix everything. He was trying to make it right. Poirot nodded. "And time, madame, time was his only enemy. And yours." He walked to the front door and opened it. Rain gusted in. "This house was a stage," he said softly. "Every step rehearsed, every word measured. But in the end, it was not a scream, not a shot, not a confession that undid the killer." He touched the edge of the muddy print near the threshold. It was the silence of a knock that never came. Edmund was led away. Poirot remained at the door, staring into the night. "Time ran out at the door," he said, "and when it did, the truth stepped in, quietly, like an uninvited guest. And it did not need to be asked to stay.